Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Rose Auditorium at the Cooper Union. It gives me great pleasure to celebrate one of our own this evening, Diana Agrest, this year's Distinguished Irwin S. Chanin Professor. This lecture is also a celebration of a lifetime of scholarship. At my request, Diana has prepared a talk tonight that travels across decades of inquiry with the explicit address to architectural form. Well known for her pedagogy and scholarship at Cooper Union, I thought this would be a good moment to reflect on another facet of her architectural contributions in the realm of design itself. Right before the pandemic, we came together to help Diana launch her book, Architecture of Nature, Nature of Architecture. And with contributions of many scholars, this was also an occasion to celebrate some 10 years of the graduate program at Cooper Union, an effort she championed since its inception. Her other books include The Sex of Architecture, Architecture from Without, Theoretical Framings for a Critical Practice, Places and Memories and a Romance with the City, as well as a monograph, Agrest and Gandelsones Works, which includes the work of Mario Gandelsones, her partner and fellow traveler throughout the years. An architect by education, Agrest's intellectual trajectory has ricocheted between theories of language, anthropology, film, psychoanalysis, and the environmental sciences. Her departure from Buenos Aires occurred in troubled times, but it landed her in Paris in the era of Roland Barthes. She was one of the very few who dared transport Barthes from literary theory to architecture and in turn to transform architectural discourse through semiotics. In all this, her work on architecture would gain a centrifugal pull towards externalities, both physical and conceptual, with a focus on the city, the landscape, and eventually the environment at large. Her articles, The Return of the Repressed, The Misfortunes of Theory, and The City as a Place of Representation all come together around a common set of theoretical preoccupations with the question of ideology always lurking in her findings. In her analysis of the American city, we learn of the gendering of nature. I quote, "Identified with the female sex, nature was to be enslaved, inquisitioned, dissected, and exploited, an identification that justifies the search for power over nature, as with women." In The Misfortunes of Theory, Agrest maps out the demise of architectural form, the result of the rise of planning, construed as activity systems. Planning's economic underpinnings gives rise to the devalorization of form, physical configurations, the eventual loss of the object from a political perspective. And yet she fights on. And in The City as a Place of Representation, Agrest examines the difficulties of forming the city as a place of reflection on the past versus the urban realm as a space of projection towards possible futures. Here, representation, reality, and rhetoric become intrinsically intertwined, not only as articulated ideas, but also through ideologies whose shadows are cast in hidden practices, messages, and norms that naturalize the way we conceive of reality. For those of us fans of Diana's pedagogical style, we love the tête-à-tête psychoanalytical process, Argentinian to the core, involving not only a deep probe into the motivations and methods of a design process, but most often a confrontation with the self behind the author, whose inhibitions, safety nets, and assumptions are in such dire need of demystification. For those who are bold enough to confront themselves, Agrest emerges as the ultimate teacher, allowing them to effectively learn from themselves. With her work presented at MoMA, the Walker Art Center, and the German Architecture Museum, among many, many other places of note, Agrest has had a long and illustrious career in dialogue with the greats. Her early years at the Institute is lovingly documented in The Making of an Avant-Garde, the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies, 1967 to 1984, a film she wrote, produced, and directed, and something I suggest all students please see. And while many of us were the beneficiaries of this particular generation, having been taught by them, not so many of them continue to have such an academic presence today. At Cooper Union, it's not just Agrest, but also former Dean Anthony Wiedler, who can speak to the debates of that moment. What Agrest will bring to us this evening will not so much be a chronology of her work through these decades, but rather certain salient themes that bind them together. Jana, I must apologize again for not being able to moderate this session tonight. Instead, we are so fortunate to have an individual whose knowledge of Agrest's work, history, and contributions will have even more far-reaching implications. Historian, critic, curator, and scholar, Kurt Forster has been so generous to accept this responsibility, indeed pleasure. As founding director of the Getty Research Institute, he established major collections, an international program of scholarship, and a publication series providing editions of fundamental texts for the study of art and architecture. A director of the Swiss Institute and the Canadian Center for Architecture, there are few centers of scholarship that Forster has not transformed. Having established the doctoral studies program at Yale School of Architecture, where Forster served as professor, he's also taught at Stanford, MIT, and the ETH. Thank you, Kurt, for stepping in such short notice, but I really cannot think of anyone better to be able to shed light on the expansive body of work we shall see tonight. A student of Argentinian pedagogies myself, the work of Diana Agrest was never far away from my own education. It was fortuitous, however, to have had Agrest lead the very search committee that eventually brought me to Cooper Union. Indeed, to cap off my education from an entirely different perspective. The last 6 years have been transformative for me too, and in great part the result of this new milieu she enabled for me. For this reason, it also gives me immense pleasure to be able to celebrate Diana's contributions to Cooper Union and to architectural discourse at large. So, without further formalities, Diana, please help me to welcome her to the podium. Diana.
I'm going to unmask myself. Thank you, Nader, for your generous introduction. I actually, is this working? Can you hear me? Okay. I actually am not going to do my entire trajectory because it's a little bit long and a little bit boring. And so I'll just sprinkle with their more recent past and still ongoing. And I'll sprinkle with some references to older projects. But most importantly, what the selection I've made for tonight has to do with projects that in a way either pre-announce the interest and preoccupation for issues that frankly I've never stopped caring about and dealing with in different registers of my work. And so maybe the connections are jumpy, but I'll try my best. And I'll try to, most importantly, my point is that for me, everything starts from the city. I've always said and written that the city is the unconscious of architecture. And I'll try to show in some way, not one-to-one, because what one writes and what one does fortunate, never one-to-one. Somewhere they meet back here, but it's not. I've never done theory to have recipes for projects, but rather to rethink critically what I call inherited ideologies and the ones that were at a moment of crisis when I graduated myself. So this project, the first project I did, when in a brief stint between Paris and New York. And it's a billboard, actually it's an exhibition pavilion, and it's a billboard. It's painted like a billboard. It is a billboard, only that is started by people vertically and horizontally. So that the wall, important, like the wall on the books, is a vertical plane, is a billboard, is a floating stage over urban asphalt, which is a horizontal plane where it's standing on a temporary scaffolding structure. So many possible narratives come out from this collage that's painted there by billboard painters, actually, when billboards were actually painted. And events happen at the bottom, cooking, ruffling. It's for domestic appliances, so it's a lot of fun. So that was something that had to do with dismantling in a certain way some of the concepts of architecture and the space itself, because this was about creating a place and where spectators and spectacle are one of the same, and actors. So from there is a very big jump to a project in China, in Shanghai, that took quite some time. It was a very large project. We won a competition to produce a master plan for the area of Suzhaui in Shanghai, China. All my Chinese students will forgive me for my pronunciation. I could never learn Chinese. And basically it's an area within the inner ring. And what's interesting about this, if you see here, my arrow, that's the size of a block in Shanghai, and this is Manhattan. So that you have a sense of scale of what this is. The important thing is that this was a place where many concepts were explored. It was about creating disparate connection between different areas. Actually, if anything is about reading the city, this was. And in a certain way, there's also questions of the narrative of each of these places that were there. We started from where this was done with Mario Gandolsonas, and when I'm going to talk about projects, I just myself, I'm going to say it too. And so here there were 6 different areas that we dealt with in detail. And here they're represented, one of the issues was to establish, one, the concept of network, and second, the concept of point of energy, a kind of urban acupuncture, whereby these otherwise disconnect in a very large area, activities and narratives that go with them, a sports center, an antique center, technological university, traditional Chinese medicine and modern medicine, it's a business, et cetera, et cetera. And so here's a plan that shows these different elements. It's like the organs without a body or the body without the organs, whichever way you want to take it. And so you go from the mega sports area to the fabric of the design antique area, to the film center, to a business center, to a Suzhaui Square, which is enormous, and so on and so forth. And here's one of my preoccupations that was always there, is the green. This is not nature in any transcendental way, but there was very little there. And so one of the things we did. And what is on the right, more importantly, is the multi-layer aspect of this plan that has gone, and I'm gonna get into detail, but goes from not only the different land use done in a more systemic way, but also traffic, sustainability, any number, all the layers of different things. So I'm gonna show just 3 of the projects that we focused on. One being the Shawi Square, which was a place for, it is, I think it still is, I just saw an aerial view, I haven't been there in a long time, if major traffic intersection, a nightmare, surrounded by malls, and it's a very commercial area. So what the project here proposes is actually to make a place of spectacle and cover some of these roads in the intersection and emphasize the pedestrian actually in this sea of cars with these, which looks like one of those highways like that you see the postcards from Shanghai that edged with lights, and a mega fountain here, which actually got inspired from the Bellagio Hotel in Las Vegas, which has the dancing water following the music. And we thought this was very appropriate for this place, very popular. And as you see here, the scale of people, that was enough to get things going. And most importantly, is the place really one of the aspects that I realized has appeared throughout the work as a preoccupation in every aspect, actually, is that of spectacle and the city as stage, the city as film, et cetera, et cetera. So this actually seems to be pretty consistent. This one instead takes a different reading, which is reinstating fabric, which has been, a lot of fabric has been erased and demolished, particularly around the city center, leaving the garden, at least the garden there. And so this is creating what is the Ishan Design District as fabric, a new fabric. And you see on the right how it was produced, and it starts from reading the Chinese gardens. And for the Chinese gardens, with their sequence of spaces, with the relationship of transitions between open and closed, the edges that are established, the boundaries. And I could go on and on explaining what makes a fabric that you can make even with objects like here. It doesn't have to be necessarily attached to the edges of the street. There could be other things. I could still have a sense of fabric if you have the right ingredients. And the next one is Film City. It's something, all of these things we proposed. There were no one gave us a program. So we started reading the city and proposing what had to be done. And so Film City, there's the old studios, the extraordinary tradition of Chinese cinema. And their actual production, the Shanghai Film Institute, but they did production, they produced In the Mood for Love, for instance, although it was made in Hong Kong, was produced by them, and many other extraordinary films. And so here, again, the building becomes secondary to the city in a sense. It's not one object, it's an assemblage of objects that mixes with the fabric. And here's some close-ups as it bridges the street with multiplex, cinematheque, hotel, production studios, what else, museum, et cetera, and offices. So that there's an enormous number of elements that would be otherwise separating the city, but they're all put together as these pieces of assemblage immerse themselves in the fabric. And here's one of the most important concepts for me, which is that of sequences, and sequence of different narratives across the different areas that we proposed, creating new narratives as they are linked together by anybody, whether it's by foot, by a shuttle that we also proposed, or any other manner. And here's the activities, which we call 24/7, daytime and 24/7 on the right. Now here's another big jump, because I'm gonna go to a project that's very dear to me, and that was very important. I wanted to stress on projects. The Shushaway project is important because first, a different land, a different set of cultural codes, a different type of city and problem, and also because it allows to really explore or apply maybe many of the different issues that were present in other projects. This one actually came from the city. The Return of the Repressed Nature I put there because actually that's the essay I wrote after I did the project. It is from architecture that I always do theory. I don't do the theory before, unless somebody asks me for something, and then maybe. So it is also The Machine in the Garden, China Basin. And so this was started from a literary piece. It was an invitation from San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, invited 5 teams of architects to propose a project for an exhibition called Visionary San Francisco. Now, what I asked myself is what's visionary in the city today? This was 89. And I answered myself, no buildings, no buildings. And the reason I answered that was that in every city, there are a bunch of buildings, a simulacrum of some fantasy Manhattan, but there was no city there, no urban culture, no nothing. And it was pure about consumption. So my reaction, I guess, came from deep down. I didn't reflect on it, just came up. And the moment I did that, nature popped up. It was like magic. It said no buildings, and bloop, here I got this image. And so this project, which is actually, I want to read what I wrote, and this is just my own. It started as an office project for the exhibition, but then it became my own project. And not only did I do it for exhibition, but develop it later. The city as object of desire is transformed into the city as a place where the force of desire is set free. The China Basin Project, much like Donna Haraway's Cyborg, is about transgressed boundaries, potent fusions, and dangerous possibilities. This project is a provocation. It is, to paraphrase Haraway, a fiction mapping our urban, social, and ideological reality, resolutely committed to partiality, irony, and perversity. It is antagonistic, utopian, and completely without innocence. So here's a mantle of green that covers this enormous surface, and within which there are these courtyards where different programs, all about production, are housed around it. In between, there's no determination. Where they mix, like in the city. And in a way, I thought of it more recently. I thought, these like Radiant City in reverse. You know, it goes down, the green is up, the fabric remains there below. Here, there's a genome project center, a training Olympic center, reinstatement of the baths that were closed in San Francisco, a scenographic institute, sitting cinema, what else was there? Museum of the 20th Century, and agricultural experimentation place, which is this wedge here, to grow what now it's called organic, and a market where it could be sold. And here is the sections, or 2 of the sections, where you can see these, they're very deep, actually, they're almost maybe too deep. And so actually it's all public, it's all accessed from this public place on top, the green. And actually the city just runs under. Of course, and the way to circulate through it is through this set of mechanical circulation systems that go up, down, sideways, diagonal, etc. So it's a machine in the garden. And this is a photo montage I did later. And I'll try to read it, but you can read it. Nature and the machine join in the creation of collective territories, residues of the forces that traverse the subject, the memories, the emotions, the rationalizations, the history, the stories, and the assumed knowledge are fixed by lines, by marks that project the force of desire, the survival of an experience. A movement flows through earth and body, reaching through the gaze into the depth of the universe, in the framing of infinitude, in the folding, collapsing of the sky onto the earth, through edges, borders, the borders of the body. Orifices and borders are the makings of a body. Border, edge, and frame capture and lose focus in an oscillating movement between the recognizable and the unknown. The trace of a body of woman that embodies desire is itself and the other. Woman as gender constructs a new nature. And now we make a big, big jump here. And I'll tell you why. We go to New York City, to the South Bronx, and the community center, the Melrose Community Center, which was the first community center to be built in 36 years. And the corner which was built was the most dangerous corner in all 5 boroughs at that time. I went with no problem every time. So basically, here's the plans, and it's very simple, but it's the context is what's important, because it is in the context of 3 houses, or what was called housing projects: Melrose, Jackson, and Morrisania, one of the toughest ones in the city. And this open field there, you can see in the site plan, was like the wind would blow you away. And here we have an object in the land of objects, the objects I criticized in the previous project. But these objects, this housing, in relation to modern urbanism, I mean the early modern urbanism of Radiant City and others, had still believed in these buildings, this housing, this object with the green, as a social contribution, as something that has to make life better for everybody and for those who couldn't afford the luxury of other modes of habitation, as opposed to towers in Dallas or Houston or anywhere else, where the principle of the modern movement have been really appropriated and distorted. So this is 2 parts: the ellipse, which holds a corner addressing the 3 housing groups, and the bar where all the activities of a center, which are education, computer, etc., what they do in community center. There was an area addressed to teenagers, and but this actually is used by everybody, with a link in the center that can separate day and night, so the center can keep on working while the bar is closed. One of the most important things about this project, which was done with a very, very small budget, is New York City Housing Authority. We are also selected out of many interviewed in the Design Excellence Program. And what is most important here is a proposal of having curtain wall, because this is a land of fear. Everybody's hiding, barricading behind walls. So when I proposed if they would dare, we brought a few 3 alternatives. That the idea was very simple. It's like paranoia. If you don't know, your mind keeps on going. So if you see, maybe it's better. So the idea was to be seen and to see, and to make it the fear away of the other, of the unknown, or the known but feared. And so the community, which was represented by all women, African American and Latin, an extraordinary group of people, they just ran with it. And I said, maybe we can put a grill. No, they said no grill, no defense, nothing. If we're going to do it, we're going to do it. Nobody ever broke a glass. And so here are the circulation and the class. You see, classrooms are glass too, and they're painting bright colors, so they can be actually seen day and night. And this is another one that I'm just tailing with, where actually the repress is the street. So this is a project in Brookhaven in Brooklyn at the end of the line. And again, since that project, the New York City Housing Authority asked every architect to use glass in their community centers. So something that in architecture is nothing, it was even done with storefront framing, became like a real important element socially. And I just love that. And here, the street is reinstated. And here, 2 volumes again, playing with each other. One is the sports, like the other one, big gymnasium. That's multifunction. And in this project, what's interesting is that the place of activity, the classrooms or activity rooms, are placed in a random. Actually, I papers, shaking to locate them. And so that people can use any room, the circulation is informal, so that the formality of teaching of classroom is really put into questions and giving freedom to those using them there. And so we go with the city. After we did the master plan, we were asked actually by the Shanghai Film Institute to do a project for them. And so this is International Film Center in the same location, but different now in front of the actual possibilities and commands. The interesting thing here is that this project is marked, here are the plans, which, as you see, there are 2 bars bridged by another. It's a continuous, actually, it's like a film. It's a continuous band with montage of different activities, different narratives. And again, the program is very varied, and it goes from the same as the one I explained before. The museum becomes a very prominent element up here. And these, just like a film strip, as they used to be, no longer are. And every place, including a film street, film theme street there. And every place, the public place becomes important. This is what interests me. The permeability of the private by the public. And that's in every project that we've done, urban, even houses. The private is permeated by public, literally or conceptually, and depending on what the project is. Here, there's this huge plaza, and you see here with the fountain, and the here is the detail of a section with, for instance, in this case, it relates to a museum, but they're offices. But they're done in such a way that with the stairs, it could become also a screening place. And here is the spectacle again. They have a red carpet. So we did a red carpet, which traverses there under this bridge. But the most important thing about this bridge before the red carpet is that the bridge is there because diagonally on this side was a construction of a subway line under it. And so I love the idea that the city literally runs through it under. And so here the bridge is not the bridge that was in the first proposal, but it's a bridge that's both continuity, but also it relates to the fact that there is this infrastructure. And the red carpet, of course, addresses, spectacle, and of course, the VIP and people watching. And on this other end is the museum, film museum, with screens outside. And this is the entrance to the cinemas below never mind. And this is a view of the hall from this side. And on the left, you can rotate this building to, it's a row rotations to see the different ways it would relate to the context. And now it is the activities and the fact of we're going back to the green, but now it's something to do with the fabric. And so the city is here again, as it runs through all these projects, but now the green has come in. And this is the fabric in the garden. And it's not the machine, it is the fabric. And it's in Boulogne-Billancourt, which is half an hour from Paris. And here's this first sketches that had to do with using the existing fabric, but adding a grid, American style. And this was a competition with several stages. And then on the left, the sketches are, these are Mario sketches, which I love these sketches. They are the traversing the fabric, the way of cutting through, exploring possibilities. But in the end, the French don't like grids like that. So after first stage, then this is what I did. These are my sketches. And so one of the things that have appeared in other projects, and then it appeared here again, is a displacement between the streets in the fabric, and the fabric itself. So here, islands of fabric, but the streets continue. They're based on that grid, but they also relate to the fabric around. So these are all variations. And this is a project that was proposed. And as you see, every place here has both street and green as an integral part, not as a support, not as a leftover, but as part of a flow that runs through the fabric. Both streets and green run through this fabric. And on the bottom, there's a ghost there of a project done many years before, which is what we call fabric as object. So instead of object as fabric, is fabric as object. And here is a speculation close-up and a section. It's on the edge of the Seine, and there's many more aspects to this project that I'm going to dwell on. And because we have green here, and we have fabric as object, now we have houses as object. And this is a farm, and this farm is in Uruguay, in South America. And it's a gentleman's farmer, of course, but it's a farm. It's beautiful. I love big views and horizons. That's my fantasy. And so here's actually, it's a cluster of buildings done one at a time and framed, as you'll see here, have a view from the one house to the horse stables there. I didn't put the riding ring. And so this is, it's not a full house. They're all like pavilions. This is the main house. And there's a little window. It's an homage to John Haydock, the horizontal window there, right here. I was very conscious of that. It wasn't an unknown influence. I just did it. And here's more views. So it's very simple. They're just these cubes that remind me of some of the estancias, the old houses with this very basic geometry and porches. And then I did a lot of work on windows, finding ways to deal with the windows and shutters, but I'm not going to get onto that. But here's one of the views. And these are more views. Under this gutter, there's a big recipient to collect the water that goes down and is used for irrigation. And the construction is very simple, standard material. So this is now a general view from outside and one view from inside. And here come the walls that frame everything and make, again, here's a sequence again, only now it's between these little objects that are private, but still there's a common ground. And so here's a wall that separates the main house from the guest house, which is here. And the guest house take that motif, but it's a variation. So they're all variations and oscillating, the walls oscillating between Barragan and Mies. And then comes the stable, the horse stable, which is my favorite actually. And so I gave horses windows so they have a view. And I just love that. And then now, we're going now again to the green continues. And here we're in Des Moines, Iowa. We've been working, doing 2 vision plans, 1 and 2, for almost 30 years. And in the first vision plan, which is right here, downtown, there's a long park that was called Gateway Park at the time that we proposed to replace the used car dealers with the plastic flags flying there, which was the first thing you saw entering from the airport. And it happened. And the interesting thing is that it was always the community and the city together, everything we did there. Great planners, great city planning department, and a fantastic group of people in the business community. And so here's this diagram shows the size of the Metropolitan Museum. If you put it from Fifth Avenue to Park, and it takes over the width, more than the width of a block from street to street, that's the size of the park. So here in this plan, you can see the full length of the park. And actually here's a Chipperfield building, a library. And now there's also a piano. So this park has inspired a lot of architecture events, but these are occupied, and this was already done as green. And this was actually occupied with some banal park that somebody had done. And so came Mr. Papajohn and his wife, Mary, who have an extraordinary collection of sculpture, could be in any top museum, and wanted to donate it to the city, but to be seen publicly. And so we came up with the idea for the park, and which basically is creating, first of all, getting out of the flatness of Des Moines and creating an undulation, but at the same time creating open rooms for the art and ways to discover behind these mounds, to discover it. And then down here, and these are, Plensa, Scott Burton, you've got here, Morris, the best stuff. Down here is Piano's new building, which is an art center, actually. And here's other views of the sculpture and people. And that's a view of the park. And so this will take me to the last project that's still in the working, which is also in Des Moines, and which is an urban agricultural corridor. This project actually tries to bridge, once again, we were instrumental in the cultural corridor with many interventions. The city has changed. The city is full of fabric now. It was like parking lots, lots of great restaurants, even an east side, which was like the bad part. Now it's like the cool side. And it's amazing how the city is transformed through the first vision plan and the second, which became law, actually. This one is still in the making and is a very, very long, it's 1.5 miles, agricultural corridor, which is trying to, you see here both lines, and this agricultural corridor, bridging the Des Moines River, which separated east to west. And the story of Des Moines is that money flew west and they left the inner city, to be 9 to 5 and flattened so that it would, that has a whole other story that has to do with the decentralization of the American city. And here is a linear development of greenhouses that articulate between existing buildings and that bridge that separation. And it has orchards, it has greenhouses, and then it has actually, there's a railroad track there that goes through, and this land is really unused. So this is a proposal to create that. And as you see, there are greenhouses, there's science, there's innovation, there's orchards, there's farming, there's market, and there's sports. They're connected to a school eating program, food program, to a homeless shelter where they're going to get jobs and produce their food. So this is going to give jobs to a lot of people, create local food, and incentivize more food programs in the city, as well as some landscape features producing plants for the city itself. And the greenhouses are like modified found objects, because all we want is standard greenhouses that we can slightly modify to achieve different functions and to have a movement. So it's not just like a whole, uniform line there. And some are high also, vertical greenhouses that as they exist. And this is at night because they work at night with the lights, the purple lights and so on. And while the offices are closed and nobody's there, now there are people there because now it's no longer 9 to 5, but they're not necessarily in this place. And this is, in approximate view. And here are some books. Thank you. I don't know what we do with the lights, or Kurt, do you want to come up? Oh, do we have no chairs? Mauricio? We don't have chairs.
You will think you get a standing ovation instead.
I can stand here.
Coming up.
Wonderful, Diana. Thank you very much. You certainly deserve more than a swallow of some kind of grateful element that will sustain you. Thank you for a wonderfully precise, extraordinarily wide-ranging, and highly stimulating presentation in which you demonstrated step for step that what everyone sort of takes for granted and associates with one thing or another, a wall, a curtain wall, etc., can be sprung from their bondage, as it were, in the conventions of our culture, and that therefore can become something entirely new. So after hearing this lecture, I need not argue that Diana is an eminently talented teacher, a lucid and persuasive writer in the preternatural spirit of discovery, even I would say of adventure. Numerous times in this very school, I sat in front of startling drawings made by her students, drawings of aquifers, of remote rocky coastlines, underground caverns or distant mountains that invited one to enter them as a sort of prospector. And I think that came across wonderfully, that you are the prospector in all of these places, discovering possibilities that seem strangely lost, or perhaps to our own sensibilities, oddly estranged until you touch them. So students must have experienced what it is like to be a member of one of those search parties or remedial missions as they're sent out into their own work. In graphite, in stains of color, and across grainy patches of ground, one's eyes in these drawings began to detect the first traces of thought in matter. And Diana wanted students to start over as if there had not yet been an architecture, certainly not one for those sites and purposes. She rekindles an awareness which, like will-o'-the-wisps, sends flashes of light into obscurity. Now, her film chronicle, to which the Dean alluded rightly, and of course, I assume you have seen The Making of an Avant-Garde, this chronicle documents the famous and the famously contested history of the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies that existed in New York from the late 1960s to 1984. When I visited the Institute almost half a century ago, and then in a very peripheral way had myself involved in its extraordinary activities that again ranged far more widely than one is apt to recall at an instance. At that time, I formed a lasting memory that extends into journal propositions, various lecture and publication programs, exhibitions, and the like. In Diana's film, I encountered another place, other people, other thinking, than I recall. All too often, in fact, we're told that you cannot alter the past, only hope to act in the future. Seeing Diana's film convinced me that you can alter the past, or at least you can look at it in quite another way than it's been recalled by others. And that is exactly what I experienced again as I was looking at some of the projects, some of which I vaguely recall from time ago. And it is here that they sprang another idea, another possibility, other manifestations on my attention. I guess what that tells us is that Diana is an architect. For architects always work from vague premises, run up against obstacles, and operate under obdurate conditions while holding fast to something only they can quite imagine. And so that is both a pedagogical and architectural and a practical accomplishment, I believe, of the highest order. So I'm sure you're eager to comment, to ask questions, to respond to this summation of such an extraordinary set of ideas and practices that one every so often was able to catch a glimpse of.
Maybe you have a question.
Oh, I have many questions. But I don't want to. I don't want to hog the limelight, right? But you were warned about the light shining on
No,
you.
it's no longer shining. No.
Yeah, but you're used to have the light shine on you.
No.
So please, I'm sure you have interesting responses, reactions to the work, particularly some of the work that really deeply enters into the body of the city, almost changing its anatomy, changing its topography. Perhaps one of the greatest accomplishments of architecture is to change by its appearance things that we took for granted were there, what they were, and that was all that was to it, right? And instead, we retreat to the point where we try to improve the piece or the lie of land, the lot, the condition, the building. We maybe improve it in some of its performative aspects. Maybe we give it a better appearance, but that sort of then would be the limit and the conventional limit of architectural expectation and activity. But in fact, what you showed with the latest project in particular is that, in a sense, this town would become something else than it's been by an extraordinarily light-footed intervention, actually. Huh?
Yeah, well, it's not very light-footed, it's very long.
Well, no, but light, you can go a long way if your feet are light enough in the town. Well, please. There is a microphone here, and I believe if you get up and speak loudly, I think one will manage to hear. Yes, please.
Hi. That I find really interesting, but I was mostly curious about a project, the last one, the agricultural strip. I've always been really interested in urban agriculture, but sometimes I believe that the real value of urban agriculture is not the producing of food for consumption, because we live in polluted cities, because even if we test the soil and it's not polluted, maybe in 2 months it will be, because there will be rains. Maybe after 2 months again, it will be not. So it's really a tricky thing. But I strongly believe in the pedagogical, I don't know how you say in English, but I'm sure you understand what I mean, value of urban agriculture. Nowadays, I'm sure a lot of kids, they believe that an apple is not the fruit of a tree, but it's the fruit of a plastic bag that grows directly in the supermarket. So I want to know your point of view. What's the real scope of that project, of that? How do you see agriculture in the cities nowadays? Because time passed since you have done that project. How did your thinking evolve from that moment? Thank you.
Well,
my question was clear. I'm sorry.
Huh?
You know, my English, my accent.
Yeah, no.
Thank you.
The idea of the agricultural corridor came because it's Des Moines, Iowa, and it's a land of agriculture. Of course, it's specialized, definitely. It's not diversified enough. But the city, first of all, it has brutal climate. So the cold is terrible, and so is the heat. And so it's a perfect place for urban agriculture, where a lot of things could be achieved during a lot of months where it's dormant, not at the scale of general, agriculture, but it is educational. One of the functions is educational, and actually it will be connected to a very interesting food program in schools, public schools nearby. But it also creates jobs, for people in the city, and it's big enough to produce enough food for use in the city itself. There are lots of restaurants, for instance, they could use local produce produced there. There's institutions, there's lots of places. Not to speak about, there's a homeless shelter that one of the supporters of this project has founded himself. And so this project was interrupted for a while because of the political thing, it's like who was in charge and in the Department of Agriculture and so on. There's one person who was Secretary of Agriculture with Obama who's coming back. So that's very interested also in this project. This is a project actually we proposed, as many of the things we've done there. We proposed, and the interesting thing is when we started the vision plan, that I didn't want to, it's too long ago, and I've shown it before, the vision plan 1, we did these fantastic drawings of reading the city, very abstract, mostly on by Mario, beautiful drawings. And we met in front of the community every time, proposed something. And then we had a translator who was the head of city planning. And he said, tell me what you want to say. And he said it. And then he had big pads of paper around the walls. And then everything people said, he wrote. And then it was transcribed. And then we used it, we paid attention. And if it was possible, we incorporated in the plan. But they understood all of these drawings perfectly. They didn't need all picturesque, nothing. They understood the drawing that showed the blue and the yellow, on both sides, each side of the river. They understood a lot of things that were going on. They're really looking very deeply, and we did many, many projects for this.
It's interesting that you talked about the repressed, right? One could also say in very immediate and practical terms, so much has been relegated from the cities. The modern concept of the city has virtually squeezed out almost anybody else. So you have to if you want to use a saw on a piece of lumber, you have to call someone from Astoria to come and do it, right? Because not only the production of food, the presence of animals except dogs, which by now are serious competitors with the population, but are also the people who do operate with other materials, who produce other things, right? That you, for instance, the fact that we are now seriously reconsidering what ought to be repairable. You don't have to throw it away because the switch is gone, right? But therefore, for that, of course, again, you need the presence of people. You can't expect to ship it out to be treated somewhere in the desert and then shipped back. So it is almost a vindication of the fact that the mix of the city as it historically existed, where there were animals raised in town, there were, of course, plants raised, there was a lot of material goods were transformed and produced and finished and so forth, that these come back and they would be expected to change the nature, not only of the city physically, but of the experience and life of people in the city.
Exactly.
Yeah?
The interesting thing is that what happened to Des Moines is that it was a city with fabric. All those old brick buildings, et cetera, et cetera. 1962, the plan, Bartholomew Plan. And I remember what it looks like. They had a bunch of buildings and nothing. When you got to Des Moines, you saw the grid. It was like, the tabula rasa, you deal with the fabric. It was like a reps drawing. It just had the streets, lots of parking lots, one tower. Never made another tower since we got there. Just the fabric remained at a different height, continuous, et cetera, et cetera. And so they realized it was a disaster. It was 9 to 5. And it was empty. And everybody living in the suburbs. And the moment, of course, we proposed lots of housing projects, but they never happened, but housing happened. Not our projects, but housing happened. And so people live there, and so there's time all the time, there's activity later, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe generations have changed along the way too, but people want that, exactly what you're saying. So
but it's really also interesting that what you introduce is not some kind of a riff on idyllic restitution, right? It's not that there is this does not have any kind of pleasantly archaic or appealing flavor to it, but you employ exactly what would be required in order to do all of this in contemporary terms. That I think that also creates other connections between what is already there, and so that this isn't just a transplant from another era, but it is literally a fleshing out of things which would have been expected to be there. And you do the same by choosing certain vaguely, we could call it typologies, certain ideas about what the volume, what the building can look like. And by bringing that back into the city where you would never otherwise encounter it is a comparable concept, conceit. Yes, please, Tony.
So,
microphone. No, here's Mauricio.
So I love the way in which you elegantly repress what you call theory. And what I love about your work is that underneath your work, there's running a whole set of ideas and constructions in language, in form, in abstraction that submerge, come to light in what I would say are the stories, right? And what I love about the theories that I know underneath your repressed architecture, or your architecture that represses theory but itself speaks theory, is the way in which two kinds of questions that arose very powerfully in the 60s, and in the kind of Parisian milieu that we were all deeply involved in. One is the Roland Barthes of mythologists, And it's the small story which is paradigmatic of a paradox or paradigmatic of a moment in the life of a culture or life of a city. And I see in every one of these schemes a short story, right? That somewhere in each of those schemes is a narrative that you built up out of your observation of what happens in an actual place or an actual city or an actual landscape. You narrate the story and transform what happens into something that you make and contribute. But at the same time, then the more almost clinical moments of semiological and linguistic analysis that allow you to dissect the elements of architecture in such a way that reassembling them allows you to tell that story. That's how I see it anyway.
I like it.
I think that was a not only customarily perspicacious of Tony Vidler, but I think it cuts right into an essential part that you are fighting schematism with stories. And I think this draws on a tremendous power, namely the power of experience that we can share and from which we gather our stories, and we can oppose this to the sort of totally impersonal, quantified planning idea about things, right?
Right. When you start, the idea is you always start from what's there, and that has its own narrative, right? And you engage. In a certain way, I'm more of a part of a Z, because I'm very metonymic, my mind work with association. So in a way, the narrative is not that I need it, but I think it's also important because I think through what basically, as you know, and I've written, in the city, architecture is just one element. So the city is so much more. And so I'd like to see what's excluded, what's not there, and that other architecture that the city generates itself, and what you do with that, And so I think in a certain way, that.
You've obviously told a very convincing story. And how, please.
Thank you, Deanna, so much. So I would like to ask you to spend a little bit of time on more explicitly on your pedagogies. And I have a question. I've certainly had the pleasure to continue to have you be my teacher as I've sat on crits with you. And I've seen you both introduce and then develop projects so that they have come to, and studios so that they have come to have an identifying name. There was the Nature of Architecture, Architecture of Nature works that were produced over the 10-year span of the graduate program, but also in the undergraduate program, the archive project, I think of as a project, the reading the city, the film in city. But recently, I was on a recent crit, and a question came up for me that came up through the projects, and yet I didn't hear it answered, and I thought maybe you would address it, and that is the distinction in architectural representation and your own pedagogical projects between the body and in all its ideation in terms of what can be found there metaphorically or urbanistically or for architecture, and a figure in architecture, in architectural representation. And I heard a very interesting conversation between there was a conversation in the drawings between two different projects, one of which had the body in it clearly in an exploratory role, and then another one that had figures in it. Would you just riff on that a little bit, maybe?
That was in the recent studio? It depends on, I think that's how you take the figural. You know, a figure is an element of representation. A body is an actual thing. And so if you have a body present there as a photographic or as a collage, I suppose that's, I can't remember what project it was. They would have had the bodies there. I don't know how it was. But I don't, it's interesting because that question reminds me of somebody else's question concerning that, which had to do with the drawings in nature. And it was Caroline Jones. And so she said, but there's no human, you know, presence, or what I said, but these are drawings, right? The figure doesn't exist at that scale. The body is not, you know, so it's not present because at the scale of this phenomena, that's not where, you know, they're drawings, these are drawings, you know, so they are what they are about, but they're drawings too. So I don't know what would have been the specific project to, I don't have a universal answer to that. But I think that one has to remember that a figure is an element of representation. And therefore, when you want something to be like it looks like an actual body, you know, like a photographic image, I suppose, would be, or drawn realistically, I don't know, and a figure that indicates a human presence. You know, I think it's also, I think it has to do, it's a specific representational issue of what you want to say. What do you want to say? What are you saying when you make a montage of a figure? There, as many people have done, including myself, you know, it's something that you can do if you want to, I don't know, make a point or not.
But maybe that sculpture park was an interesting moment in regard to this difference, because one has the impression that the entire area of the park was readied in order to have places for figures to be set into place. Right?
Yeah.
It's a little bit like if you want to plot something. So you have to have the right hole in the right place. You have to shape the soil around it. And so this park area was made ready for the figures of sculptures, which then the human bodies could interact with and in a sense experience their other presence.
But I never drew one.
No, of course not.
I never drew one. That's the thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Is that the point of
in fact, if you would have had to draw one, what makes one suspicious that obviously might be something you haven't thought of. Right?
Yeah. So I'm sorry, Lisa, I don't think I can answer your question better because I don't know which was the case. If I made a point, it must have been relative to what was being drawn and what the issue was about. If it's replacing something, it's like trying to stand in for there's not being anything else, or there's no need because, you know, what you need to see something else. And therefore I would say, but if it's a difference between a photographic image like a montage or a drawing of a figure, I think it's a matter of choice of how you want to tell your story.
Do speak up. It's very difficult to recognize people from here against the light. Sorry.
Thank you. It's been a few years since you've been my professor, but I feel like I still have to say Professor Agrest. Thank you so much for a really amazing, really quick retrospective of your work. And I was really interested in that project, The Machine in the...
Which one?
The Machine in the Garden, I believe that's what it was called. And I love the term that you use where the city as an object of desire. And I'm really curious in how, for you, desire plays a role in helping you to create urban form.
I think you have to speak louder because with the mask it's very hard.
I'm curious in how desire plays a role in helping you to create urban form. Since one of the terms you used was the city is an object of desire, and some of the terms you used was it's utopian, antagonistic, without innocence, things that all relate to nature itself. And in that project, it was interesting that you decided to do no buildings and you brought nature to the surface.
Mhm.
So, and I would also say, like, I feel like the city is also is an object of desire, but it's also, the city is people. People have their own desires. And I'm curious how desire plays a role in you creating urban form.
I suppose there's no question. I suppose it's a statement. Is there a question?
Yeah.
How does desire?
How does desire play a role in building urban form?
In everything. If there's no desire, there's no drive. If there's no drive, you don't do anything. And that's in general, in life. But this was a project given as a visionary San Francisco. So it was there. And so that's the title, you're given something, right? So you said, what's visionary? If you're going to make a project, so what's visionary today? And in my own answer to myself, I thought, no buildings. Because not particularly San Francisco, which is a very interesting city full of fabric and so on, but the city and the American city, and not just America, I guess, in general, where there's the desire of a different kind to emulate, to repeat Manhattan, Wall Street, and the fantasy of what's the wealth is and the progress and the fantasy or whatever. And the higher, the better, right? I'm not going to get into that one. The accumulation, right? Proximity. There's nothing there, right? So I said, basically, I said, no buildings. Because what those buildings represent, what they are for, what they're standing for. They're standing for a city where urban culture is gone. Urban culture is a place to the suburbs, to the parking lots, to the internet. Not so much back then when I did this project with the internet, although it was there. But what I'm saying is that that was my instinctive reaction. Where it came from, who knows, my many, things that I think about and thinking about, including my criticism of modern urbanism, good or bad, dialectically, right? It's not all bad. There's good and there's problems. But the reappropriation, cannibalization by the corporate world, the mega corporate world, of principles that had, in effect, had a different kind of agenda, which is a social agenda. And I guess all of that is underlying my no buildings as objects. Nobody's building cities of fabric. You can make little pieces floating somewhere, but everybody wants the object. So instead of saying no object, I said no buildings. And I said no buildings, nature popped up for me. A certain nature popped up with that kind of image. It had to do with my own experience.
That also would illustrate the difference between desiring something, which implies that you have to really discover what it ultimately is. And I remember various courses that I've had, studios I've a chance in critiques to see what your students have done. And it seems that in many instances, they had to expose themselves first to the dilemma that there was no answer to where they had wound up. I mean, what would you desire here rather than what would you covet? And this coveting is what makes replications, right, of what we already know. So you repopulate any empty space with something that you already know from some other empty space that's been reforested or repopulated. So you covet the same thing. But that, in a sense, is plastering over that perhaps this place might give rise to a desire that you don't even know you can develop on this place, right? So,
Yeah.
And we're so used to the former that one is at a loss to think, well, what would you desire here, right? Because we know exactly what they would put there if they had a chance.
The interesting thing is that project was a little bit hippie in the beginning, you know. Maybe it was San Francisco. So, you know, it was like all green, and you had all these courtyards with all these great activities. Oh, the workshop, there's another workshop. Anybody could rent a place temporarily for anything from cooking to architecture to electronics to whatever. So, and then I realized there's no such thing. There's no such thing. You can't have that. You can't have the thing if you don't have a structure, if you want to have something there under. You know, very simple. And then I realized that the whole thing, you know, this very gesture got me into thinking, and then I really took it as a totally critical project, you know, of a lot of things. And then from the project, I got so interested and started reading in, you know, a lot of stuff on nature from different perspectives and philosophy and this and that, and philosophy of science and all these other things. And I wrote this piece, you know, and of course got into nature and women, gender. Nature's always been gendered female, you know, and so that's how it is. So it was a good, you know, I think that my desire always is asking questions. I think that's what it is. I would say question is the most important thing.
I mean, thank you so much, Diana. That was generous from you to really take us through such a journey of projects and with all these giant leaps from one to the other. In fact, maybe if I could answer the last question for you. If form follows desire, I think in your case, desire always follows public, or at least a certain idea of a higher level of publicness. In some ways, the way in which you have presented, you have given us a multiplicity of references about how you generate form. The sources of architectural form in your practice sometimes is metaphorical, metonymic, contextual, referential, but ultimately every single project always aims, aspires to produce a higher level of publicness.
Yeah.
And that sometimes obviously comes with ideas of nature, with ideas of inclusivity, with ideas of, you know, trying to actually dissolve some of these borders and barriers that separate us and that architecture ultimately builds. In the way in which I think the agency of your architecture for me is very clear and powerful in that one singular object. When I think about your theory and the way in which you as a theoretician and as an intellectual have contributed to produce very multiple and at the same time different forms of discourse, meaning you as an activist have tried to address issues of gender, issues of nature, issues of linguistics. You constantly shift, and as you said, you shift with the times, you adopt, and you try to transform. In a certain way, I think you're so dangerous as an intellectual because you're always trying to somehow transform that what no one is willing to take, and you have been a pioneer in many occasions. So, you know, last week or 2 weeks ago, you were in our seminar, and you also gave us an incredible journey of your history of teaching at Cooper and many other institutions, as has been mentioned before. My question maybe will follow one that I already formulated in the seminar, but has to do with today. Where are we today? What are some of the urgent issues that you believe should be addressed, that architecture should be able to confront intellectually or through practice? Where do you see a fertile ground for this auditorium, for Cooper, to somehow try to keep on pushing the discipline and the relevance of architecture in the shaping and changing of society?
Yeah, that's a very good question and not an easy one to answer, though. I would say that one of the things that it has to be Okay, let me just preface this answer by saying that the question is how we bring the preoccupations that are social, political, environmental is also social, political, etc., is how they enter into the realm of architecture. It's not just program, you know. So the question is, how do you connect at the level, you have to connect at the level of ideology, which is the ideology prevailing in discourse, if there is a discourse today, and the dominant ideology in the social, political, economic structure of society. And at that level, you can connect and then take it from there. That's my way. Anyway, it's always been my way. Because I don't think that just a program, that's if this one is a good program, that's a bad program. Yes, they're goods and they're bads. But then you can make a disaster with a good program, let's say environmentally. Well, maybe it's a good program, you know, but go lead is not going to cut it. You know, that's a racket. That's not what climate. So this prefacing that I think one of the most important things are the climate. You know, the climate the change and the environmental crisis, I think is central. What architects can do, I don't know. I think people try, but there's an industry, right? There's an industry. So how that is done, it's, you know, it's how you have to develop this at the level of discourse to enter architecture, not just the level of the pragmatic changing level from the industry straight to there, because then if it doesn't enter architectural discourse, doesn't happen. Yeah, that's what I think. And if you think pedagogically, if it's to me, always a project is, but the project is per se, but also has to address discourse every time. Now, therefore the question. It's like when I tell my students, they have heard me, some of them are here, when I say so, it doesn't have to be a thesis, any project. So where are you? Where's your idea? You know, where's the criticality of the approach you take? You know, but that is what has to do with discourse to me. So what I'm saying is it needs people to work at the level of discourse on that together to pave the way or help also in the practice. That's how I see it. Because there are many issues, and trying for sustainability, it's patchwork because the big issues are not taken. And I don't think we have the power, unfortunately. So we keep on doing. But I think on the other hand, I think students should be conscious of what's going on. For instance, I wouldn't do these ridiculous tall towers. You know, it's a matter of complete ridiculousness. Nobody needs them. They don't help anything. They're just to talk about, because I was talking about the buildings, right? Who needs them? Do you think the small footprint is going to help when you have to, you know, have the foundations be, you know, screwed in Shanghai? You know, whatever is the antipode, Beijing, I think it is, you know, to hold it, you know, it's ridiculous. 10 stories of concrete, solid concrete, because the view sells for more at the top. So let's waste the 10 floors. You know, the mentality that goes with it, the corruption, the social corruption. So I think that students, first thing, they should aim for integrity, for social integrity and concern. I think it's number one, to be a good human being as a real human being. That's what I always taught my daughter. I never asked her for grades. I said the most important thing is that you're a good human being, you know, and we can be learn to be human being in architecture because we need to do that. It's a humanistic discipline, but one of the very few left. And so that would be my take on it, as more philosophically speaking. But in the end, as problems, actual problems, I don't think there's a more serious problem. Sure, and together with that goes everything else, all the social that we all know. Yeah, the social, political issues in the world. But things that would, you know, sure, the programs, the subjects are important, how they're taken. You know, but I don't have many more answers because they have the answers. They should have the answers, not me. It's their generation. You know, I knew what I wanted to do a long time ago and then change and maybe make tons of mistakes or whatever, or tried, and some succeeded, some didn't. But it's their turn. Ask them.
Certainly, the idea that we need to actually make ethical architects, and that there are many forces at play, and that it is not just about form, and that the discourse that we inherited is also problematic in many ways. I think you answer it by far.
But on the other hand, you see, I always focus on the city because it's a place of social action. It's a place of culture. It's a place of a public or possibility of the public, you know, rather than the object. You know, it's a choice. You know, I love making objects, and I always tell everybody I can go from theory to fighting for the head of a screw with a contractor. But I'm saying, as a principle, I think that's where culture and society is developed. And this other architecture that needs or doesn't need monuments. A few monuments are okay, but you can imagine in Shanghai without the monuments, right? You just create the narratives. Narrative will outstand any monument in time.
Yes. You seem to dive down.
So just moving.
Well, that was a very forceful statement, which I think holds a whole number of possible readings. One, of course, is that it's always so convenient to bring any problem you have and lay it at the feet of architects, right? As if they somehow, by some quirk of destiny, were the ones who ought to be able to solve your problem. Mm-hmm. You know? And so there are these particular locations where everybody brings their problems, expecting somehow architecture to be able to do what they all were apparently unable to do. In the meantime, making architects often forget that they actually have a profession, that there is something called architecture, and that no excuse to use it for something better is going to ratify the idea that it's good architecture because it fulfills some worthy purpose or contributes to some needed effort. Of course, it would be foolish to say that one ought not to strain all one's resources, mental and otherwise, in order to contribute to solutions which are eagerly expected, right, and necessary. But the answer cannot possibly be that you use this as an excuse to deliver architecture of a minor caliber, of a lower cut, because you can morally justify what you do. And this is a real danger, I think. Yeah.
Okay, shall we? I think this is a good time to close.
All right. Well, thank you again. Thank you very much.
I just want to say I was a little bit nervous, so I didn't thank Nader and everybody for organizing this lecture. And
he's not here.
I know, but I'm saying it anyway for the record, because it seemed rude. I feel I was rude not to. I came thinking that's what I'm going to say, and then I just saw the slide and started talking. So anyway, thank you so much for coming.